So I'm Maria Bridge. I am the Chief Communications Officer at the Center for Humane Technology, where we're working to inform people on the harms and extractive effects of the old operating paradigm of technology, and then also educate everyone on a more humane operating paradigm for technology as we move forward. And I'm so delighted for this panel of people who come from very unique perspectives on the topic of algorithmic transparency. I'm going to take a moment to read a little bit more about their bios so that you can appreciate each of the unique perspectives that they bring. So I'll start with Renée. Renée is an AI ethicist, data activist in residence at the University of Virginia, and a co-lead for UVA's involvement in the Public Interest Technology University Network. She specializes in ethical AI, AI leadership, diversity, equity, and inclusion in AI, algorithmic accountability, data integrity and sovereignty, algorithmic justice, AI policy, and governance. And then Natalia leads data and AI ethics policy at the Central Digital and Data Office at the Cabinet Office in the UK. And she previously advised on open government and open data policies for the Department for Digital Culture, Media and Sport in the UK. And she has research experience in anthropology, gender, civic tech, and economic development, and recently co-edited a book. And Irene is an AI safety expert. She's conducting novel AI research and leading public policy at Hugging Face, which is working to advance and democratize AI through open source and open science. She's also advising responsible AI initiatives at OECD and IEEE and led public policy at OpenAI previously. So that is our panel. And I'd like to start, because each of you bring such a unique perspective from the private sector, from the public sector, and as I found from Renée, from both the private and public sector and activist perspective, I'd like to understand what algorithmic transparency means in the context of your work and why it matters and why you're so passionate about this topic.
I work specifically on language models at Hugging Face and previously at OpenAI. So it's a form of generative AI system. I usually call it like a text generator. So it will predict the next word given a string of words. And I think it's really important to be specific about what kind of system you're talking about here and then break down those components of a system. So when I work with a language model, I'm working with these enormous data sets with a lot of computing power. And then I'm also evaluating a model. And when we're thinking about algorithmic transparency, we're also thinking about documentation and communication of different components of each of those components. So my background is policy. I love a good framework. And I'm looking at what are the parts of a data set that I can be really evaluating, especially at this huge scale. And then how do I communicate that? A popular, again, framework, we love that, is from Jebru et al. Data sheets for data sets. There's no real standard of how to communicate this. It's one example. And another example of how to communicate about models is Mitchell et al. Model cards, which actually Hugging Face and Big Science, a community that we host, just released today. It's on Twitter, so hopefully if you follow me, you can find my retweet there. But we love a good promotion as well.
So from the government's perspective, I think we really need to remember that ultimately at the end of any decision that we make, there is a real person. And we tend to automate many of those decisions these days. And this is for good reasons, right? Because it saves us money, it saves us time, it frees up government officials to do other things. But we need to remember that some of those decisions do affect people in really profound ways, and they do have a right to know how those decisions were reached. So if we automate them, we need to be transparent about how, where, and why we're doing that. So I think algorithmic transparency ultimately boils down to communicating clearly about how, why, and when we're automating those decisions. That's from the public sector perspective, of course.
Maria, thank you, and thank you so much for having me. Substantively, I'm a criminologist and a criminal psychologist. So much of my work looks at justice. And if we're talking about transparency, then we're talking about due process. We're talking about duty of care. We're talking about due diligence. And these are really critical to ensuring that if we are dealing with data and we're building these algorithms based on data, what we want is accuracy in our decision making, because we're using these algorithms to really deploy high stakes decisions. And in criminal justice, and I always say that criminal justice should be the conscience of AI, as a data activist, should be the conscience of the data scientists, to ensure that if we want to get the requisite level of accuracies, we have the requisite level of transparency. So it comes back to justice, it comes back to equity, it comes back to diversity and inclusion. So transparency is about accountability, it's about openness, and it's also about communicating that openness and communicating that accountability to the stakeholders in particular. And we're all stakeholders when it comes to algorithms and when it comes to AI and when it comes to the digital space.
Very well said. So I want to dig in a little bit on what we mean by transparency, because it's not just an on or off switch. What that actually means in practice. And Irene, I know that this is from a more technical perspective. You may have some thoughts on what transparency, what that range and that spectrum looks like, and what we're really would be beneficial in at least the context of your work.
Right. So for some more context, I do some more engineering work about evaluating and being able to document these more qualitative aspects of AI systems, something that is inherently not quantifiable. But I especially love what Renée is saying about looking at specific risk-based use cases. And this is the approach that we're seeing with the EU AI Act, with the US Algorithmic Accountability Act. But what's really difficult for general purpose systems that don't fit into a specific use case. But what's important here is these questions that Natalia is asking: for whom are we evaluating these systems, and to whom are we communicating? So something that's powerful in transparency is making sure that what we're documenting is not just accessible to engineers and technical people, but especially the people in this room and watching this live stream, and policymakers and civil society. So concretely, the kinds of evaluations that I would run on an AI system would potentially be putting a quantifiable metric on something like toxicity, but balancing that out with a qualitative analysis of how does this actually fit into a specific use case. Let's advise, do not use this for recidivism. It's extremely dangerous, and really put it into an applied perspective.
And then I would connect that to your work, Natalia, which is trying to make clear in I think, a unique two-tier way of communicating. I'd love you to talk about what it means to make transparent in plain English.
Sure. That's one of the big things, actually, that I've spent, the past 2 years thinking about and working on. So in the UK, we have a very strong transparency and open data movement. And there were a few lessons that we've kind of taken from that, which are, if you release a lot of information about what the government does, there is a very small, very niche group of people that will be interested in that. But the truth is, the majority, if you just walk down the streets of London or any city in the UK, really, and just stop a person on the street and ask, what do you think about algorithmic transparency in the public sector? They will just look at you and say, what? So what we were really trying to achieve is meaningful transparency, and making sure that whatever we're doing lands well with not just this fantastic audience that we have here today, but actually just anyone, my grandparents, for example. So we ran a deliberative study with the Center for Data Ethics and Innovation and the research consultancy Britain Thinks. And in that study, they actually asked a number of people from different backgrounds in the UK, people of different ages with different levels of trust in government, different experiences, no digital skills as well, in case of some of them, what kind of information we should be publishing about how government uses algorithms. And based on this study, we developed our algorithmic transparency standards. And as you mentioned, Maria, the standard has 2 tiers. And this is precisely to cater for those 2 different types of audiences. So tier 1 is a very basic, plain English description of what the algorithmic tool does, why it's being used, and where and how to find out more information. So it's something like, we using this particular tool to, let's say, save money and evaluate your applications for benefits faster or something like that. And then tier 2 has 5 different parts, and it has more detailed information about the data that was used to train the model, for example. And that's something that I'm sure, Irene, you can tell us more. How do we make that part of it transparent as well, because quite frankly, it's a huge challenge. And it also has information on things like human oversight or the entire decision-making process, which I think, especially in the public sector, is really important. So it's not just the internal workings of the algorithm we're talking about, but actually, you know, whether it informs any decisions, who has the final say. And then, you know, we also have a section on a risk and risk mitigation, which, again, something that people are not too keen to talk about, but we should absolutely cover.
Renée, I'm curious about your thoughts on the translation of the actual algorithms to different audiences, different people who are affected by them.
Definitely. And just coming back to that question about transparency, we've got to always appreciate that transparency is about public trust, and it's about public confidence. And it's also about legitimacy in the models that are being created. So if we want to deliver that, then of course we've got to be accountable. And we've got to ensure the things that we're doing are not only explainable and auditable, but that the individuals whose information, whose data is being processed and to come up with these decisions understand what is happening as well. Because some of the challenges we see from a perspective, I will say from, let's say, digital policing, an area in which I work, or digital surveillance as well, or even the deployment of digital force against individuals, is that weaponization of the data. So when we think about these algorithms, we've got to think beyond the algorithm. For me, I speak about a legacy. What an algorithm does, it creates a legacy. And in a split second, by a decision made by an algorithm, it could really change the trajectory of a life. Some of the things that I've realized when it comes to data would be the transmission of intergenerational trauma through data when we think about criminal justice, when we think about social services, when we think about the ways that we are using algorithms to make these decisions. So it's so much bigger than the algorithm, because what we've also got to appreciate is that an algorithm can deny access, deny resources. It could really undermine things like productivity and development and sustainability. So it's so much bigger than just the algorithm. And what the transparency requires of us is that understanding that we've got to bring a unique level of maturity to the process, which includes, of course, justice, equity, diversity, inclusion, and also bringing that trauma-informed approach to the ways in which we think about technology.
Thank you. Irene, I know that you also have, I feel like you also would have some unique perspective to what Renée just commented on based on your work.
You beat me to it because I was just about to ask Renée a question. So I have this frustration with complaining about this pipeline problem and reaching especially marginalized groups that need to have a voice at the developer table. And a lot of what I work on in this field of AI safety, generally AI safety is said to mean reliability. So an AI system is following the developer's intent. But if any of y'all have spent time in Silicon Valley or with the general conference community, I don't really look like what a lot of developers will look like. And it is not representative at all of the people that these AI systems and algorithms are impacting. So I'm really curious to hear from Renée and from Natalia, especially on how do we engage with the groups that are being impacted? How do we make this the systems that especially are being held by high resource institutions? And Hugging Face explicitly, our mission is to make our systems all open source and accessible. But how do we also engage with these really high resource institutions and these big tech companies on reaching the people that are actually impacted and ensuring that we have this bi-directional communication, especially for people who might have a technical communication barrier?
Well, I would say it's even more about just engaging with those groups, because one of the things that I always say to my students, because I teach big data ethics at UVA, is it's about stretching your imagination. So it's not so much engaging with the groups, but it's engaging with our own thinking and looking deep in our own minds and seeing what creates that bias, because that is the intention we bring to the design process. We bring our own thinking. So if we're honest about that, and if we we ask those uncomfortable questions, and if we are bold enough to deal with the answers, then we bring a new kind of thinking to the design, a thinking that even brings more value to the process. So one of the things that we always say is the unintentional consequences of technology. And by doing that, I think we let ourselves off very easy because we just believe that that group is now collateral damage. So there is no unintended consequence. Each consequence feels very intended for the individual, the community, or the group that is now vulnerable to the design and the deployment of that design.
That gets back to the responsibility piece of this, that responsible for the effects, whether they were intended or not. They're responsible to be aware of those effects, as you articulated so well. I
have another comment,
and
then I'll step back a little bit. But I think it's also important to recognize the lens at which we're speaking. I'm speaking from a very privileged US English perspective. I mostly work in US English, and part of what we're trying to grapple with our large language models is reaching under-resourced languages and languages that might not be as digitized, and recognizing our author biases. So I'm curious to hear from both of you, especially from these multicultural perspectives. And a lot of my work is cultural adaptation, so ensuring we're not overwriting with these more Western and developed country values. What are ways that we can standardize having, especially developers, share their perspective and ensuring that we are clear about where we're coming from and with whom how can we get these values from these underrepresented groups without being exploitative? And this is also speaking from my lens as like a woman of color. I'm also Muslim, and a lot of the work that I've done is looking at race, gender, and religion. Again, that does not mean that all these other protected classes are not as important. It's just I have less insight into how to evaluate those. Shout out to a lifetime of discrimination across those three vectors. Just, makes me a little bit better qualified than maybe your average Silicon Valley person to look into these.
Natalia, you can go. I answered the last one. I mean, I can do it, but I don't want to monopolize the space. So I know you haven't said anything in a little while.
Thank you. So I think, don't expect me to have all the answers. But I would say deliberation. Deliberation is a part of an answer. And this is what as someone working in the public sector, I would like to see happen more in the private sector. So deliberation and collaboration. Hello, I think it's back. What was I saying? So deliberation and collaboration with civil society organizations. And this is what we've been trying to do. And in terms of setting expectations and making sure that this is not exploitative, I completely agree. And I think what's really key is to make people understand why they should engage. And, there are things like citizen assemblies where people are actually paid for their time. And I think this is fantastic because that gives an opportunity for people who perhaps normally wouldn't be able to dedicate this time to participate. And they're being paid, they're being appreciated for deliberating on some of those big questions about the future of tech and algorithmic transparency in this case. So that's one area. But then again, I think during COVID, the deliberative exercise that we ran was online. So even though we had people who had pretty much no advanced digital skills, they still had enough digital skills to turn their computer on. They still had a computer, which I think, the challenge is much, much broader and bigger than that. And this is why we should also engage with civil society organizations, with grassroots groups, with activists, with everyone who essentially understands some of the underrepresented groups and people who are discriminated. And as governments, we can't often reach them. And I think this goes for both governments and big tech companies and the private sector more generally to open up and to make it easier and more valuable for people to actually engage and take part in those processes and challenge some of the things that we do. And what Renée said earlier about evaluating your own thinking, your own process, I think that's absolutely right. And just asking yourself over and over again, what is the worst thing that can happen if I release that particular model, or if I put this algorithmic tool in the decision-making process? I think that's a huge, huge part of that as well.
I would say it begins with respect and not just simply paying lip service to diverse perspectives and diverse communities. It's also about deconstructing knowledge and understanding that our communities are producers of knowledge, because I think we always think of knowledge in the high and then the low. But having that appreciation that each community produces a unique set of knowledge that we use when we come to thinking about data and thinking about designing algorithms or models or systems or solutions or products. So I think it's really having a unique amount of respect for all voices, particularly those vulnerable voices, but not just simply designing or defining them as, you know, our under-resourced or high needs, our communities, but just really having that understanding and knowing that those voices are the most critical voices to some of the work that we're doing. So I think if we come from a place of respect, then we come from a great place to start.
So something that all three of you have touched on is this multi-stakeholder approach: listening, care, respect. There's a bit of preaching to the choir here, but how do we get people who are moving fast and I won't say it, but moving fast and you know where I'm going, and maybe not taking the time to pause, not taking the time to reach out, to listen, to consider, to really challenge, to ask the big questions. What thoughts do you have on that very big question about what's happening in the private sector in particular, where there's not this respect or reflecting, deep questioning?
Well, I think what's happening is what we're experiencing. We're experiencing many of the challenges, the undermining of democracy, disinformation, violence. We're experiencing that. And I think we've got to also appreciate that moving fast doesn't mean necessarily that you're going anywhere. It could be.
Just on that treadmill.
Right. So I think if we bring that level of understanding to the space, and we bring that level of intention and really thinking, then we would understand what we need to do. And I think if anything, and I always say it, is that we never want to get to the point where we've got to create algorithms to teach us how to be human again. So if we think about what it means to be human, and if we think about what that human-centered approach to AI and algorithms really mean, and if we think about each other and doing the right thing, then we are going to get the kinds of results that we really want.
I completely agree on the directionality. And I would also love to get Natalia's perspective, especially on regulatory tools. It's really hard to regulate these kinds of things. And when you're creating this huge umbrella that's supposed to encompass systems from language models to facial recognition, where the evaluations barely overlap, if at all, I'm excited to contribute, but lightly envious that it is not me in that position. So I do think that the regulation and having these many different approaches to being thoughtful and really enforcement mechanisms is helpful here, but would love to hear from Natalia.
Sure. So we don't move particularly fast at the government. Let me just clarify that. In terms of regulating, I actually have some colleagues from Ofcom here in the room who will be sharing their experience of that, hopefully later today. So where I sit is essentially focused on the public sector within the government. So you could call it self-regulation, really. It's basically making sure that we are getting things right before we go after other sectors. So what I do is going around the public sector in the UK and saying, how do you use AI? How do you use algorithms in your work? Do they assist decisions? Do they support decisions? How and where? And then I say, well, okay, let me help you make this information more transparent. Let me help you put this into our standard. Let me help you communicate that to the members of the public. So I think what we're trying to do is to lead by example first. And there are many private sector companies that have started to do that as well. You know, we've all heard of model cards and the kind of transparency statements. So I think the movement, the beginnings of this global algorithmic transparency movement are there. But again, you know, it's some of the criticism and challenges I would like to offer perhaps is that mainly that's the big tech companies that have the resources and time to focus on that. And when it when it comes to governments as well, you know, there is a very small group of governments that are actually advanced in this space. And I think we should be very careful not to reproduce some of the mistakes we've made in the past by monopolizing this conversation.
Model cards have come up a couple times, and I'm actually not sure everyone does know what a model card is. So I would love for you to explain that and how that's a tool.
Yes, absolutely. So model cards, I am coming from research, so we love to cite. So Mitchell et al. It's now a more popular form of documentation that is also, we're very lucky that Dr. Meg Mitchell is at Hugging Face, and I get to just bask in her glory, but really work at what are the different components of a model that we need to be documenting and sharing with the world. And different companies will take a different approach to it. So I wrote the model card for OpenAI's GPT-2, which is the predecessor to GPT-3. Not the most original naming from one to the other, but so it just gives you a more succinct overview of where is the model being trained, when did the data stop being scraped. There's different sections that just make us kind of like a checklist of what you want to share with folks. And it's becoming more of a popular form of documentation. Actually, Meta just released their language model, OPT-175B, what just means 175 billion parameters, which is the size of the model. And they released a model card that shares about components of their model. What are the kind of out of scope use cases? What should we not use this model for? What are some of the risks and ethical considerations here? GPT-3 has one. A lot of the models on the hub have one. And I'm really glad that we're, as a community, starting to have some norms. But again, none of this is being enforced. There's no standardizing body, and there's really no enforcement mechanism. A lot of this is goodwill among researchers who truly want to do the right thing.
And that leads to the other question I had is, what demands should we be placing on private sector black box algorithm making machines? What would you like to see have happen? Or maybe a call to action for people, any of you?
Well, I think what we want to see, of course, would be the regulation. We'd want to see that, but we also want to hear the conversations, the voices, the discussions about what needs to be done. Beyond the fact that we want to regulate, we've got to bring the requisite level of understanding to what needs to be regulated and how it's going to impact. It's going to impact us. So I think from my perspective, I always come from that place of justice and that place of due process and understanding what we do is it's fair and non-discriminatory, and we remove and we reduce the high levels of bias and discrimination that we're seeing. So just not the regulation, but we want to see regulation in action, in an active space where we could understand that this is happening and this is what's being protected. So not only that risk-based perspective, but also bringing that rights-based perspective to the space as well.
I would also be conscious, going back to Natalia's point about where is this regulation coming from, and me being, my heritage is from a developing country, and recognizing this Brussels effect and what is impacting the regulation in the rest of the world. From what perspective are we looking at? And even from a regulatory perspective, it's a lot of very privileged people that are able to be at the developer table, the writing table, whatever y'all folks call it over on that side. But really having a active engagement with the more under-resourced parts of the world that are absolutely being impacted by these kinds of systems and are developing their approach to regulation as well.
I'd like to echo what both of you just said. And also when it comes to bringing the whole world to this table, I think when it comes to public sector and global algorithmic transparency movement, I think now is the right time to do that. And because this is a this is early days of that. So I think we all, and by we, I don't just mean the UK, but really all of us here in this room, we need to do more to make this conversation more inclusive all along, really.
I'm curious, looking ahead, trends that you see in this space that you're excited about, or maybe even concerned about, things that we might be talking about in a year or two from now.
You guys keep putting me on the spot.
I'm also
Anyone can
happy
jump
to
in.
chat.
Anyone can
I
jump
mean, this
in.
field just moves really quickly. For example, when I released GPT-2, it was November 2019, and then GPT-3 launched as an API in June 2020, just for a sense of how quickly these models are coming out. But also, I'm really impressed with how much more community in the research side that we have around these norms and being conscious of communicating with each other about what we're evaluating and how we release things, and really sharing our lessons learned. One thing that I am really excited looking forward, if you're familiar with the ML conference space, there's a lot more attention towards the ethics sides, toward how we're building data sets, and there's more workshops, there's more acceptances of these kinds of papers that aren't used to be called not technical enough because they have this sociology lenses, or these interdisciplinary lenses that people are recognizing now are absolutely critical.
I think for me, this space, what's happening here today is a trend that really makes me happy, because more and more we're seeing these kinds of communities coming together, and we're having more conversation around responsible technology, around responsible AI, around ethics, and just thinking about ethics in the AI and data science space, because each of us represents so many communities right here. And if we're having these conversations, it means we're taking the knowledge back to those places that need to have it. So I think there's a very vibrant movement of AI and data ethicists, and just people who are interested in doing things differently and responsibly and in a mature manner. And I think that excites me, and that gives me hope.
I'll be a bit more pessimistic here, and sorry, just because if I was to be optimistic, I'd basically repeat what you two just said. So one trend that I'm a little bit worried about is transparency washing. And it's essentially companies and possibly some public sectors as well pretending that they are being transparent, but there is no accountability there. So I think, again, one really crucial point here is that we can't have meaningful transparency without good, well-functioning accountability mechanisms. So I really hope that through all this community work and conversations and sharing knowledge internationally, we can eliminate that worrying trend.
All right, last question. Is there something that you see from your perspective that others may not have the opportunity to see that gives you hope? And I know that we already talked a little bit about forward looking, but there may be a specific example from your work or an anecdote or you may be able to share too, just to kind of make things concrete.
I mean, I love to self-promote. So I'm going to give an example of my research, the process for adapting language models to society, that was spotlit at NeurIPS, which is one of the bigger ML conferences in December, and not as a criticism of my work, because I love what I do, but I don't think that kind of work would have been spotlit, or I'd be surprised if it would have been accepted maybe 10 years ago. So I think this is a concrete example of seeing more folks in the, especially technical side, really start to recognize, incorporate, cite, and look for how to integrate these more social science perspectives and think about whom are we impacting. I just really hope we don't get to the point of we're washing it so much, like Natalia was saying, that we actually have to hurt people in order to recognize that it's a problem and really be proactive right now.
For me, I would say one really positive thing that I see is that around the world, there are many well-meaning public servants that really understand the mission and the need for greater transparency. And I'm talking about obviously my colleagues from the UK, but also colleagues from Canada, France, the Netherlands, and all the other countries that I personally engaged with, and through different international forums as well. But there are people in this space who really want to make a difference and who really want to bring it back to greater transparency and engaging the public. So that gives me a lot of hope.
I will say for me, it would be, of course, my students who are very excited about big data ethics and AI ethics, and the many requests I get from high school students to have this conversation with them around AI and algorithms and ethics, and just bringing that justice-oriented and trauma-informed approach to the work we do. That gives me great hope, because I know the future is definitely in good hands.
Oh, lovely. Well, big round of applause for this panelist. Thank you all.